So last time I talked about globalization and the structures that go with globalization and so forth. Today I want to talk about foreign policy and diplomacy, starting, as is my wont, a little bit historically, and then talking about the U.S. here and now. And next time I want to take up two policy issues, namely the international economic issues, trade and such, and immigration and migration, okay? And then we'll take it from there. Obviously, during questions and answer time, you can ask questions about things that happen. You know from, I don't know, Shakespeare, reading novels, whatever, that since the time immemorial, city-states, empires, kingdoms, and so forth, states or units, whatever they were, have sent representatives to other units to negotiate something, to negotiate war, peace, other things, right? So that there's nothing particularly new about the idea that states have to find a way of interacting with each other. Now, in the days of yore, there wasn't a lot of subject matter. I mean, it was, talking about war and peace and military and occasionally ships that were conquered and so forth. But over time, of course, the number of subject matters increased. But even in those early days, when a representative from A was sent to B, they had to be given safe passage. That is to say, they had to know that they weren't going to be captured and killed. So early on, as part of international law, rules developed to make sure that you could have reasonable interactions when heads of state wanted to have interactions, and that people were fairly safe. Now, of course, in the days of yore, it took weeks very often to get from one place to another. Not that long to get from England to France, but much greater distances, so that international diplomacy often was very slow, right? It's nowadays instantaneous, but it was very slow. It used to be the idea that it was one person who would represent whoever the head of the government or the state or the unit was. But as you recall from last time, increasingly in the 19th century, there were also group enterprises. There was the Congress of Vienna. There was the Congress of Berlin in 1885, which is very important because it divvied up the world for colonialism. Right, the great scramble, which essentially had people who were representatives of heads of states like Bismarck and so forth, take a map and divide the world by country, which is how you got the borders of the countries in Africa and many in Asia and so forth. So that having negotiations, diplomatic negotiations, and carrying on foreign policy by meeting with representatives from different states phased in the 19th century. By the time you got to the 20th century, you of course had the League of Nations and eventually the UN and so forth. So these processes became formalized, right? But you no longer had just one representative of one state meet with another. You often had groups of representatives meet and sort out policy. From the U.S. perspective, when the Constitution was written, it was very clear that even though George Washington said, no alliances, the fewer alliances, the better off we are, no entangling alliances, how he put it. But the Constitution of the U.S. very clearly marked that we were going to have relations with other countries. And so the Constitution, American Constitution, very clearly says what the role of the executive is, what the role of Congress is. For example, war powers, right? The Congress has to approve war. Not happening these days. We'll talk about that later. But in any event, it said that very clearly. And furthermore, it was clear to the founders and certainly to Washington that while you had to have the executive needed help, as in different departments. And the two first departments of the U.S. government was, in fact, what nowadays is called the State Department, and the other department was what nowadays is called the Defense Department, but early on was called the War Department. And you can see the embeddedness of this in our constitutional thinking by the succession. That is to say, when a president becomes incapacitated or whatever, the vice president takes over. We all know this from whatever elementary school. And then it goes to the the head of the House of Representatives, and then it goes to the plenipotentiary of the Senate. But the very next, it goes to the cabinet, and the first cabinet it goes to is the State Department. So the Secretary of State is then next in line after you get through Vice President and the two heads of the two houses. So we have built in our Constitution a rather orderly process of doing this. From, again, the from the international perspectives, as there are more and more interactions between countries, late 19th, early 20th century, you also have the situation that the representatives of countries in other countries, ambassadors, right, are not just roaming around, but they're appointed and they're situated in a particular country. So you will recall early in American history that process was formalized, and for example the first ambassadors were Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, so forth. We know this all from our high school and whatever histories. Now, these ambassadors, who were then situated in other countries that one had dealings with, were meant to be the eyes and ears of the country. So the American ambassador in France would be the eyes and ears for the United States and the president and the State Department, who would see what's going on in that country, so in this case the U.S. would be well informed, but he or she, in those days they were all he's, would carry messages between the home country and the country in which they were situated. And that was the mode of communications. That was before, right, Wi-Fi and telephones and all the rest. So for Washington to communicate with France, the ambassador, Benjamin Franklin or Jefferson, would have to come back to Washington. He would be given marching orders. He would take 3 weeks or whatever to go back to the ocean and tell the French what the U.S. wanted, and back and forth. So this was very slow, but it was very formalized, and it was considered very important. The reason you had your Jefferson and your Benjamin Franklins go overseas, who were already famous people, was because the relations between the United States and other countries was considered important, right? In this sense, to some extent, the U.S. just fell into lockstep with what other countries, or older countries, were already doing. So the embassies became, in a sense, the eyes and ears and the information source for a government to make foreign policy. Right? And it's currently relevant, so let me just reel down. And you might have wondered why it is that the Turks couldn't just go into the Saudi Arabian consulate. The reason is that an embassy or a consulate is considered part of the sovereign territory of the state whose embassy or consulate it is. And there are incredibly complex, interesting rules in international law which people have to follow and are meant to follow, except when they're violated. For example, when the Iranians took over the American embassy, that was a violation. They entered American territory, so to speak. And where are these rules embedded? Their rules are embedded and they're documented in the United Nations for all countries to follow, and they're also embedded in each of the foreign ministries, which is what other countries call them, and whatever formal representation there is in one country or another. This is all a very formalized dance, so to speak, and you could ask, well, for example, in the United States, if there is, let's say, the Turkish embassy in the United States, well, it's Turkish territory. The U.S. can't, and the U.S. police can't just go in. You might say, how far can that be taken? Well, if there's a fire in the Turkish embassy, the fire department of Washington, D.C. is allowed to go there and put out the fire. But they can't just go in and arrest people or say, we want to see your documents and so forth. And that's fairly sacrosanct, which is why when it's violated or broken, for example, when the Iranians marched into the American embassy, there is a big brouhaha, right, which lasts 20 years, 30 years, and whatever, about this whole situation. So, we can get back to some of this, but it's fairly technical. It's adhered to. Why do countries adhere to these things? Because it is in their interest to do so. If we violate your embassy, they can violate ours, right? So there is a national self-interest in people adhering to those rules. However, where is foreign policy typically made? It is typically made in the foreign bureaus, foreign ministries, foreign offices. Different countries call it different things, and in our case, the State Department. And the State Department, which was once upon a time a small unit with some expertise of people in Europe, obviously has grown like Topsy over the years. The U.S., in contrast to many other countries, actually had far more limited foreign relations up and until including the Second World War, because we were less entangled with other countries. We followed the advice of Washington. We considered ourselves to have, through the Monroe Doctrine, special interest in the Western Hemisphere, but we didn't often bother much with other parts of the world. They were either colonized by other countries or whatever. So when we got out of the, I'm doing big swaths, skipping around here, when we came out of the Second World War as a dominant power in the world, our State Department had expertise in all kinds of things, but not expertise in many parts of the world. So, for example, just to illustrate this, when President Kennedy became president, there was no expertise in the State Department on any place, for example, in Africa. In fact, there wasn't even an assistant or deputy secretary of state for that entire continent. Why? Because these were European colonies. We didn't mess around with that. Right? We didn't have any reason to mess around with it. The very first appointment that Kennedy made was to a deputy secretary of state for Africa, who was G. Menon Williams, by the way, who was a Ford car executive, who knew nothing about Africa, but who were tasked to look out after that part of the world. And the second thing was that at the lower levels of our policymaking in the State Department, we had no expertise in the languages of many parts of the world, etc. There was such a dearth in our capacity to deal with international matters in different countries that the U.S. sort of almost panicked. And who stepped in? The Ford Foundation, interestingly enough, stepped in, and the Congress stepped in. The Congress stepped in, and some of you might have been beneficiary, by developing a Foreign Language Defense Act, which paid for people to have scholarships, fellowships, to learn exotic languages. And the exotic languages included Chinese and Arabic and a few other languages. In fact, Dale, my husband, was a beneficiary. He learned Chinese paid for by the Foreign Defense Act. Okay. And then the Ford Foundation developed a fellowship program for people to get PhDs who studied those parts of the world. right? They just paid your way to get your PhD. I was a beneficiary of that. So was to Africa. So was my husband to China. Okay, why was all this happening in the 1960s? Because the U.S. didn't have any expertise. They didn't have any expertise to work in the State Department. They didn't have any expertise to teach the next generation or anything of the sort. So there was a big push in the 1960s and onward 70s for there to be some competence in the State Department in these various areas. Now, the U.S. State Department, don't forget, at the end of the Second World War, there were about 50-odd sovereign states. Right? We now have almost 200. So quite obviously, as time moved on, more and more countries became independent on board. You needed to have more and more expertise. You needed to have more embassies. You needed to have more ambassadors. You needed to have more people who had competency in those languages. And you needed to build up some kind of competence to advise what? The executive branch and Congress about what they should be doing in terms of foreign policy. Now you may say, well, this is all sort of technical and slightly boring stuff, but it's not so boring when you recognize that right now, as we're dealing with foreign policy and foreign policy making, that a good third of all the expertise in the State Department has either been fired or has resigned. So that in some ways we're back to square one in terms of U.S. foreign policy making. Right? That's to say, we make policies, right? But we don't have the State Department expertise. But something else has also happened in the last 50 or so years. And that is, while the function of the State Department was to advise the executive and Congress and so forth on foreign policy, the rest of the departments, well, other than defense. Defense obviously immediately got busy with American military and so forth. But the agricultural department, the health and human services department, the Department of Education, these historically in the U.S. were all departments which only dealt with domestic stuff. Right? Commerce Department and so forth. They were focused on domestic subject matter. After the Second World War, increasingly, there was no sharp dividing line anymore between domestic and foreign affairs, because in almost every subject matter, there is a component that deals now with the external world. Agriculture, well, domestic agriculture in Iowa, but also agriculture in terms of agricultural policy overseas. Not only selling agricultural products, but also helping other people improve their agriculture, sending expertise, having expertise with, not just the products, the grains and so forth, but also, for example, insecticides and all the rest of it, right? So you have a big division of the agricultural department dealing with international aspects of agriculture. Commerce, obviously, has an international component. Education, we have education programs overseas. We have education programs domestically to bring people here and to train them. Not just university students, but mid-career people who get trained in different ways. The health department, which is some of these departments, by the way, didn't come into being until the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and so forth. So they're not historical departments. But for example, take the health department. It not only has an interest in health issues in 100-odd other countries. You have plagues, you have diseases, you have all kinds of things. But furthermore, ties in terms of how to address transnational health issues with the World Health Organization. So not only are these segments of all our departments of governments linked into foreign subject matter, but they're also linked in the international institutions that I talked about last time in terms of making joint programs pursuing American policies in those issue areas, and also acting jointly with other governments and similar departments. Does that make sense? It is an incredibly complicated network, right? So all of these departments have to have people with expertise in particular countries, in particular subject matters, like labor, like commerce, like environment, and so forth. And when, how do you staff those? You staff those with people who either have to learn very quickly on the job, or you staff them by, quickly training people and assuming that they can join the government. Now, one of the boons in the United States in producing people who had at least some qualifications was the Peace Corps. Because many people in the Peace Corps, after the Peace Corps, moved, had experience, knew some local languages wherever they served, had experience, but even having had the experience of living abroad put you ahead of people who never have set foot abroad and had no idea what situations might be like in the third world, right? So the Peace Corps volunteers became a huge boom to manning, womening, staffing these various departments of government. Well, let me stop for a minute and say what happened in other countries. Well, the colonial countries had large colonial staffs who had served in the colonies. And one of the reasons why countries like France and Great Britain and so forth essentially had better foreign policies for those places was because they had people who were familiar with them. And for that matter, and this is a thing we can debate, for that matter, even the UN was better off, and international institutions, because if, for example, you had been a physician or a person in charge of health, and you were, let's say, British, and you had served in Nigeria, you would be very useful for the World Health Organization as having familiarity with Nigeria, rather than the rest of us who may be perfectly competent physicians, but who had no experience how you apply and work through problems in another country, and or how you help your own country have sensible policies of one kind or another. So the equivalent for the U.S. of the foreign departments with deep colonial histories was to then quickly set up USAID, our aid agency, as a subarm for the Defense Department, the State Department, where people were then meant to have, right, expertise and develop expertise and so forth. The U.S., I regret to say, was, of course, always one or two steps behind. I mean, we noticed that we were very bad at making policy, and then somebody tried to do something about it. But this was all under the assumption that we were a world leader, right? And as a post-World War II world leader, we had to have, in a sense, global competence, right? The critique is that we often didn't have the competence we thought we had, or sometimes we recognized we didn't have the competence and so forth. But nevertheless, we decided we had worldwide interests, and therefore we needed worldwide competence. Now what? We are still networked worldwide. We're all over the place. The expertise has been eroding because there are fewer people going to Peace Corps. When there's expertise, it often comes from the military who've served somewhere else, who then become civilians and work here, there, and yonder, but who may have some knowledge, but not necessarily broad-gauge knowledge. And then you have, parallel to this sort of messy building up and then steady state, you then have a situation where the U.S. got itself involved in various foreign wars, right? Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. And of course, in many of those places, we didn't know the first thing about them, right? To this day, our knowledge of Afghanistan is very limited, even though we have all kinds of people and so forth over there. Then, by the time you got to the sort of 70s and 80s, something else happened, which is important for the now what, which is that our U.S. government agencies often decided they didn't have the expertise, but they could hire the expertise. And who would they hire? Consulting companies, consulting firms, and non-governmental organizations who might been for nonprofit and for-profit organizations, right? And those could supplement what our various departments of government could do, and so we could hire these and farm out the activities. So increasingly, as you move into the 80s and 90s, USAID didn't actually do the work overseas anymore. They administrated the money that Congress allocated, which in turn they gave to consulting companies and NGOs who then did the work on the ground. Now, this actually sounds pretty good and promising, right? You have an NGO, and they know what they're doing, and so forth and so on. Pardon my cynicism on this issue. It comes from having been a professor up at the university. Many of our students, when they graduate, they've taken, Professor Gruhn's 1 or 2 courses and 1 or 2 other international politics courses. And let's say Africa, they might have even taken an African politics course or an anthropology course. And then they get hired for an NGO in San Francisco. And that NGO has money from the USAID. And they, in turn, administer whatever it is, the program in whatever country. Okay, now all of these chaps are ambitious, they're smart, they know a little bit, but they don't have, 20 years of expertise that you might have if you've been working in this area. So what I'm saying, to stop being long-winded about it, is that the idea that if our U.S. government doesn't have the expertise, we can farm it out, and we're farming it out to consulting companies, and we're farming it out to NGOs, is in part a good idea, but it can also go fairly wrong in the sense that the people there may not be as sharp and as well-informed either. Right? So then we wring our hands and say, oh God, all this, our money, tax money is being spent and it's not doing anything. Well, sometimes it actually is doing something, but when it isn't doing anything, often the reason it's not doing anything is because they're poorly conceived projects and the people that are applying them out there also don't particularly know what they're doing. Now, I'm being unfair because there are lots of good people in this network and they're doing yeoman's work. But what I'm saying is that the idea that you move from the State Department and then all these other departments of the U.S. government have an international component is a very good idea, and in some senses it produces expertise, but it's not, soundproof. Say it does have its problems, and so lots of money is misspent and wrong things are done and so forth and so on. The next arm to all of this policy making is the increasing prominence since the Second World War of the Central Intelligence Agency. Because they're out there too, and they actually on the ground have to figure out how to know a lot of things, which feeds into the Central Intelligence Agency, which feeds into the embassy, which feeds into the State Department, which feeds into Congress and every other imaginable place. Okay, so the CIA, most of the CIA, by the way, as most of you know, aren't just spooks. Many of them just are, people who study a particular country, who know about a particular country, who make maps, who do all kinds of things. They're research people. I don't know if any of you work for the CIA, but you might not have been a spook at all. That's a subcomponent of the CIA. So the CIA increasingly becomes important, and and becomes important in terms of gathering information that neither the State Department nor other departments of government who are not in the business actually of collecting information, but putting policies out there and manifesting policies are doing. All right, so where's the CIA live overseas? The CIA lives overseas in every imaginable place, including American embassies. So some of those nice folks who one thinks are part of the State Department might be perfectly nice folks, but they're in fact, look like the State Department, but they're in fact Central Intelligence Agency. So then, in addition to that, you have the military, right, as another arm. There are lots of people in the military who have expertise, not just in military action, but actually in countries and locations and speak the language and so forth and so on. You can see, and I haven't even gone into half of it, what a maze there is out there for the U.S. to make foreign policy. And as the maze became apparent to the executive, which was meant to make U.S. foreign policy along with the State Department, the idea arose that you were the president and the president's assistants, and you sat in the White House, and there's all this stuff. But how do you get to know all this stuff? And how do you decide what you should go to for the health department or the agricultural department or the CIA or X or Y or Z? So you devise a notion that what you need to do or what you can do is to have your own staff, nowadays called the National Security Council, which is appointed by each president, which is a group of people who echo all those expertise in security issues, in defense issues, in agricultural issues, in area expertise, East Asian, Africa, South America, and so forth. And those people sift through all the policies and the information from all of these departments and provide then policy papers which say you could do A or you could do B, here's the evidence for A, here's the evidence for B, and so on. Where do these people come from? These people also come from all over. Some of them are seconded, that is to say temporarily taken out of the State Department and the Defense Department and the Commerce Department and so forth. Some are academics. Some are people drawn from the Foreign Affairs Council or the Brookings Institution or the Heritage Institution or whatever. So they are meant to advise the president, so as to sort things out, make things less confusing, and focus it. Under the best of circumstances, these people provide fairly balanced, neutral advice. The head of the National Security Council is appointed by the president. The first president who had a very prominent head of the National Security Council was Nixon, who appointed Kissinger. And Kissinger became so powerful that he could, of course, ride over all these other people working under him. And eventually, he, for all practical purposes, became the Secretary of State because a very nice man, whose name was William Rogers, was appointed as Secretary of State, but hardly anybody knew who he was or what he did. He was very nice. He was like holding fort down there. But Kissinger made the decisions and advised the president. And of course, eventually, Kissinger was sent over to become Secretary of State. Right? And others were appointed and so forth. Nowadays, as you know, the head of the National Security Council is John Bolton, who, to put it mildly, is a dangerous cat. This is a prejudice comment on my part. So it has become fashionable, and particularly fashionable under the current president, to appoint someone who represents your views, and who appoints people that represent your views. So this is no longer a reasonably neutral sorting out mechanism. This is another conduit for being able to nix anything that anybody else has to say and marshal it into the direction that you want to direct it at. So in a sense, rather what the National Security Council was meant to do was to broaden the policy perspectives from which the president could select. We now have a situation where the National Security Council narrows the issues so that it's obvious that the only thing we can do is, for example, continue to support the prince, whatever his name is, of Saudi Arabia, right? There's no question about what we need to do there, right? So it's not on the one hand, on the other. Right. And furthermore, there is no real balance coming out of the other agencies because the heads of the agencies are mostly appointed because their ideology already supports that. Now you can say, don't all presidents and have all presidents done that? Yes, to some extent. But for example, in the previous pre-Trump era, and for that matter, even to some extent under Bush and so forth, there was the idea that specialized agencies needed to be headed by people with expertise. They needed to be headed by, a physician or an environmental scientist or a labor specialist or something who could manage the subject matter. The idea now exists that you appoint people who are lobbyists for the industries which the departments are meant to monitor, which is a very different idea. And you even have ironic situations like you remember candidate Perry for the U.S. Presidency, who was going to get rid of the Energy Department when he became president, but he couldn't, in a debate, he couldn't remember the name of the department that he wanted to get rid of, right? We all remember that? Well, he now heads the Energy Department. Right? And obviously is looking out for the oil interests of Texas and so forth. So what I'm saying is under the best case scenarios of all of this stuff, you built in the United States a humongous complex foreign policy machinery, which was meant to complement the idea of the U.S. as a global actor. Right? And in contrast to other countries which continue to have foreign affairs departments, whatever they're called in various countries, many of those countries' foreign-flung interests have actually narrowed, right? The former colonial powers have narrower interests. They have interests, commercial interests, and so forth. But in some senses, their foreign affairs department are much cleaner, neater looking than our incredibly complex maze of things. And of course, that makes a lot of sense, right? It makes a lot of sense when it is constructed or misconstrued as it currently is. It's of course a monumental mess, and you might as well go back to, I don't know, the 19th century or 18th century in which the president and one or two other people sit in the White House and make decisions and don't really care what these departments have to say. Now, in fairness, it should be said that the head of the National Security Council and the head of the State Department and the head of the Defense Department, who, by the way, will probably be leaving soon, are still powerful actors in some senses, right? So I'm not dismissing them all, but I'm just saying the role that they play is very, very different. And what is very important to bear in mind is that if you are, for example, come out of college and you join the State Department, you become a Foreign Service officer, which, by the way, is not easy. You have to do a written exam, oral exams. You have to wait until you get appointed several years later and so forth. Those are newbies who come in who know very little. And 20, 25 years later, they might know a lot. Either a lot about some part of the world or a lot about a particular subject matter, law, economic things, and so forth, right? And the other thing that they know is their opposite numbers in other countries. so that they can call Smith or Jones in some other countries and saying, hey, we've got this concern, or we're thinking about this policy, can we meet, or something of that sort. Well, when you get rid of a third of your State Department, you lose all that expertise. You get rid of them all. They retire, you fire them, and whatever. So now you're very back to square one, where we were, let's say, in 1960, of having very limited knowledge in the State Department. Well, you can say, come on, Gruhn, you know, you're making this sound more dire than it is. At some point, Trump will go away, somebody else will come in power, and they'll fill the State Department back up. You can't replace 20, 25, 30 years of expertise very easily. You can hire the next generation. You might even hire somebody in mid-career, but they don't have the connections with people overseas. They don't have the skills of having, you know, worked there for a long time. So the eroding of the State Department is a long-term problem that we're going to face, no matter who the next president is. Sure, the next president can re-encourage scientists to join the various departments that require scientific knowledge, whether it's medical or environment. So he can bring people back in, but he can't replace the whole staffing, which are people with sometimes narrow, sometimes broad expertise. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying here is that from the perspective of the U.S., which I'm more or less focusing on today, we are on the one hand, in decline as a world power. We want to be in decline as a world power. We have, according to our discussion last time, unraveled, or we're trying to unravel, our participation in the global structure. We are eroding the possibility for the global structure, whether it's regional in terms of regional trade pacts, or whether it's the European Union, or whether it's the UN or whatever, by our non-participation and by our attacking these institutions, or by us leaving these institutions of one kind or another, and by us no longer wanting to fund these institutions, we're weakening the entire structure which bolstered the American foreign policy making process. Because most of our policies were no longer just bilateral, they were multilateral. And all of these departments that I was referring to, whether it's agricultural, labor, or so forth, didn't just link bilaterally into all these other governments. They also linked into all these organizations. So they had representatives, you know. Let's take the World Trade Organization, which I'll talk more about next time, right? We had not just a trade representative, but we had all kinds of people in the Commerce Department and so forth, which tied into the World Trade Organization. We also had Americans who were staffing part of it, right? So we had, but they became neutral civil servants, right? But we also had people in our department who linked them. So if you look at it as layered, that is to say, you have the US government and its expertise. You then have that expertise broaden out from the State Department and the Defense Department into every other department of the US government. You have that expertise interact bilaterally with other countries. It interacts multilaterally with equivalent organizations that are relevant, health, for example, with the World Health Organizations and so forth. You see that the map is just incredibly mind-bogglingly complicated. And you ask yourself, well, if it's so complicated, how could anybody make sense out of it? Well, by subgroups of people having expertise in one area. That is to say, the Health and Human Services Department people interacted with the with World Health Organization, with health departments in other countries, and so forth and so on. They only concern themselves with military matters or commerce matters when something overlapped or there was some issue. right? So they weren't all over the place. They were kind of narrowly focusing on their subject matter, and as a consequence, developed expertise. There's one other area before we talk, before you take the break, which is I've completely missed out on Congress. Where does Congress fit into all of this? Right? I mean, Congress has a role in the Constitution in terms of all of this. So Congress, as you know, has committees. And the committees that obviously deal with foreign affairs and foreign policies are the foreign affairs committees of each house. Right? And they have X number of congressmen and senators and so forth. What do they do? Well, they have staffs, and those staffs connect with all the other areas, depending on what the issue are. But how do the congressmen get their information, other than through their staffs? They hold endless hearings. That's almost on every given subject. And who goes to those hearings? Well, people from other departments, sometimes international actors, sometimes, academics like me. I've gone to congressional hearings and they say, well, what do you think about X or Y? Because they just know you've just written about something and so forth. And they put out reports. And those reports are meant to be read by other people in Congress when they vote. Typically, other people in Congress don't read them. Their staffs read them. And if they have to take a vote, their staffs tell them, X or Y, or show them a paragraph. But Congress is meant to have, sorry about that, Congress is meant to have expertise, and they're meant to weigh in. Right. Now, historically, sometimes the head of whoever's party was the majority, the head of a congressional committee could be quite powerful. For example, you all old enough to remember Senator Fulbright. Racist, Southern senator, or whatever. But he was a very mighty, powerful senator on the matter of war in Vietnam. He not only had hearings, he spoke up, he critiqued the thing, and so forth. So that at that particular juncture, the Senate committees on foreign affairs may not have been the most powerful actor with respect to Vietnam, but it gave us a voice. That is to say, Congress is supposed to represent us, and important heads of congressional committees very often give their constituencies a voice, whether it's everybody in the state or all of us together, or in the case of Congress, a particular region. So at various times in history, the congressional capacity in terms of foreign policy has been quite powerful or quite influential, and some presidents have actually cared what congressional committees had to say on things. The reason they cared was because they assumed that they had a line into voters who might eventually, vote. And furthermore, while the congressional committees are segmented by subject matter, the Congress, for example, theoretically at least, is supposed to agree that we should go into war. That, by the way, hasn't happened since 1942, I think. We now just willy-nilly get involved. Not so willy-nilly, but anyway. The congressional committees, other congressional committees, for example, allocate foreign assistance, aid, right? Congress allocates the aid, right? And therefore, the congressional committees who are in charge of these matters of international affairs would consult with the Agriculture Committee and other committees in terms of what appropriate budgetary allocations should be in one place or another. So when the president decides we're going to knock out $60 million here, there, or whatever, congressional committees can sometimes speak up and say, no, this isn't our bill and we're restoring it, you better spend it. That doesn't actually mean it gets spent, because the departments of government are under the executive, so the president can say, actually, we're not going to allocate the money this way. So for those of you who are Rachel Maddow junkies and junkies of other news, interesting things happen here, right? The president cuts the aid budget, right? And the Congress is upset about it, but he says, you know, aid has been wasted, foreign assistance is a waste, we're not going to do this, et cetera, et cetera. Even if Congress allocates the money, the executive doesn't have to spend it, right? So they can just tread water on it. So now, all of a sudden, in the middle of nowhere, President Trump has decided, actually, he's going to reallocate $60 million, I think it is, for corporations and businesses to invest in overseas businesses. That's what he's going to do with the money. And so everybody breathed a sigh of relief, right? Trump is coming to his senses. We're going back and reallocating money out there for foreign investments. But not so fast, friends. The foreign investments are going to American private businesses to do whatever they please over there. And whatever they please over there is to make money. And the making of money does not necessarily accrue to the long-term benefit of those countries. It could. Right? It could grow businesses that are important. It could do very good things for the economy, but not necessarily the case. In fact, it could help pollute the countries. It could do all kinds of bad things. Why does the Trump administration think that's a good idea? Because the Chinese are all over the place, and they're investing all over the place, and their businesses are all over the place. And Trump has decided, well, America first, but we don't want the Chinese to take over the world, so we're going to allocate some millions for American businesses to be more active overseas. Let them be the eyes and ears. We'll cut the State Department. They don't have to be the eyes of the ears, but we have some more investment. So it's more complicated. And where does Congress fit in? Congress only fits in when they pay attention. Congress only fits in when they get our attention. Congress only fits in if they disagree with the national policy or agree with it very strongly, one way or the other. Most of the time, it's a kind of a mixed bag. Okay? So we have three branches of government. What about the judiciary? Does the judiciary play any role in international affairs? Well, if you ask conservative justices, it doesn't, because the judiciary only deals with American judicial issues. If you ask less conservative justices, including, by the way, the conservative justice who just retired, Justice Kennedy, the American justice system needs to pay attention to international law and its role in the international legal system. So Kennedy regularly went to international legal conferences overseas where jurists from around the world were gathering to talk about problems. And, for example, on things like asylum and so forth, where there's international law, the idea is that if the U.S. signed a treaty of a particular kind and agreed to something, it becomes, according to our Constitution, and Marbury versus Madison and those kinds of cases, it becomes part of the law of the United States, and the U.S. is obliged to adhere to its treaties. And what happens if it violates those treaties and so forth? It can get even more complicated, but I just want to say the idea that the Supreme Court has to pay no attention to international law is either the position or, if you wish, an affectation of a line of judicial thought, which is America first, America only, America doesn't have to pay any attention. If you get to more internationalist-minded jurists, they say not only is the U.S. obliged under international law to do certain things, and if cases come up, they should be adjudicated not according just to the American Constitution, but the international law to which we have agreed to. but that also American laws need to take into account some of the obligations that we have entered into in one fashion or another. And furthermore, that the international judicial system is something that stands outside of the American judicial system, but is not necessarily irrelevant to it. So when, for example, the International Court of Justice makes a decision, we are a member of the International Court of Justice. Remember, we're not a member of the International Criminal Court, but we are a member of the International Court. If they render a judgment that goes against the United States, which they recently did, you should not be able to say, they don't have any rights, we're a sovereign country, which is what the Trump administration says, right? Why does the International Court adjudicate cases among sovereign states? Because sovereign states decided that it would be in their interest, it would lead to less conflict and so forth. There was a conflict the International Court of Justice recently adjudicated between Chile and Colombia, I think, and they rendered an opinion and both countries agreed to it right away, because it's cheaper to do that than to have warfare. So while the judicial branch, especially the top of the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, in theory has no role in foreign policy making, in practice, it is no longer really the case that it has no role whatsoever. How big a role it has depends on the particular jurist and what their interpretation of things might be. So the most powerful aspect of U.S. foreign policy making is the executive and everything that surrounds it. The next most powerful is Congress, if it wishes to step in. For example, in the case of declaring war or not declaring war. And then finally, there's a small element of the judiciary. All right, let's take a break. There are a lot of loose ends because this is kind of a diffuse topic, and as I said, next time I'll get back to speaking about particular things. But sometimes it's useful just to have a context for which all of this is happening. And there are many loose ends, but I leave you to ask questions. And I keep getting chastised, correctly so, for not repeating the question. So if I call on you and I haven't repeated the question, before you say anything, say repeat. Before I say anything, okay? All right, go for it. Yes?
Doesn't our two-party system create a lot of the problems you're talking about in contrast to a parliamentary?
Yeah, doesn't our two-party system contribute to the mess that I'm adding mess, Lois didn't say mess, that I'm talking about, and isn't a parliamentary system better? Not necessarily. Look at the mess in England right now on Brexit. This is both domestic and foreign policy, and they can't agree on anything, and every time the Prime Minister decides that she's going to put forward something, Parliament decides against it, or people in her party are opposed to it, and so forth. If you watch C-SPAN at all, you can see her when she has to answer in Parliament, and there are people from her own party who scream at her, as well as the other party. So sometimes Parliament makes it easy if there's a dominant party and the party agrees on it. When you have a parliament where there are coalitions that have to be built, either because everybody in a single party doesn't cohere, or because they're bits and pieces of different parties, then it's not necessarily easier than it is in the U.S. And also, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, very often people didn't used to vote just along party lines. So, for example, you have an international agricultural sales or aid or whatever bill. You might, let's say, the Democrats run the House. The Democrats from Middle America and farm states may have a very different view on the matter than the coastal people, and they might not vote jointly, even though let's say there's also a Democratic president is arguing for something. So it could get messy under both systems. Sometimes it's easier in Parliament, but not always, is, I guess, my answer. Yes, sir?
Can you talk about the choice between a political and career appointee as ambassador and how that's changing?
Yes. The difference between a professional and a career ambassador and a appointee. Since time memorial in the U.S., ambassadors to important, especially European countries like England and France, have been non-professionals who are rich. Because in order to run those embassies, you can't do it on the amount of money provided by the State Department. You need to throw in your own money in order to, have the parties and the dinners and so forth that you want to have. So while it hasn't been uniform, but in general, the big embassies in various parts of the world, which are big because of the importance of the country to the U.S. and are not big, I hasten to say, because we're at war, in a civil war. I mean, something like in Afghanistan, there may be huge staff, but that's because we're pursuing military conflict there. But in like England, France, Germany, and so forth, those typically are political appointees. Sometimes those political appointees are Governor Harriman of New York. Do you all remember who he was? He had a charming wife who became the ambassador to France because she spoke French. So sometimes, sometimes it's money and cultural adherence or whatever the case may be. When you go down the totem pole of smaller countries or countries we're less involved in, very often they're professionals, and one of your aspirations, if you are in the State Department, is to eventually make it to ambassador of one kind or another. Some people don't have those aspirations. For example, and this is something I could have mentioned in the first hour, the State Department also has a policy planning staff. So the layers here are incredible, right? So you have the State Department and you have divisions and you have people who head the divisions to deal with special issues in particular countries. In addition, you have some departments that cross all these boundaries. One is a legal department, which helps everybody do the right legal thing and develop legal policies. Another one is a policy planning staff, which is meant to assist the various people in the State Department in putting forth the various policies that the State Department wants to put forward to the executive branch, President, National Security Council, as well as conceivably other departments. And the people in those policy planning staffs very often are neither moneyed people nor career foreign service officers. They're often academics or like academics. So, for example, if you watch Sakarian or any of these programs on TV, one of the people that often appears is Richard Haas. Right? Richard Haas headed the policy planning staff under Bush 1. I think it was. Anyway, he headed the policy planning. He's a Republican. He is a fairly liberal Republican, right? So he moved from something else to the policy planning staff and then heads the Foreign Affairs Council. One of the professors of international politics at Stanford headed the foreign policy planning staff under a different president and so forth. So it's that, right? And then there are places where smaller countries don't even have embassies, right? So our notion is that we have embassies everywhere, and in large countries we have embassies and consulates. What's the difference between an embassy and a consulate? For example, in San Francisco we have all kinds of consulates, but the embassies are in Washington. Consulates historically were meant to be dealing with commercial relations for their citizens, while embassies were meant to be dealing with the political and diplomatic relations. In some countries, only have consulates, which sort of play a dual role, like Saudi Arabia has a consulate in Turkey rather than an embassy. Right? And then there are countries, small countries, which can't afford to have consulates or embassies everywhere. One of you spoke to me during the break, an interesting point, knows somebody's relatives and so forth, who represents Estonia in Mexico. This person is not Estonian. The Estonians have appointed him to represent Estonian interest in Mexico. So there, small countries or poor countries often can't afford more than a half dozen or so embassies. So they have other ways of having representation of one kind or another. Now, don't forget, I mean, it's obvious, for one thing, the foreign policy machinery of the United States and every other country was heavily dependent on the eyes and the ears on the ground in some other country. Nowadays, you pick up the phone, or you Skype, or you pick up you email or whatever. And that has, in some senses, weakened the role of the formal policy-making institutions. For example, the State Department, because one of the reasons the foreign policy mechanisms in the executive has become so important is why the hell contact whoever, Smith in the State Department, who might be traveling, so when he or she gets back, you want to consult with them on something and you want to know something about what's going on in the country, you might as well just pick up your phone or your iPad or whatever and talk to either the folks in the embassy in that country or your opposite numbers in that country in the actual government, right? So technology has changed diplomacy and has changed how foreign policy is being executed. And that seems like a virtue. And in some ways it is, but in some ways it's also a vice, because decisions can be made very quickly without the consultation and thinking about it and asking other people and so forth. You just sort of think like the president does. You get up in the morning and you make foreign policy on your Twitter account. Thank you. I'm incoherent. On your Twitter account. So that has changed things a lot. And it's very difficult for the embassies in countries to even know exactly what their role is. Because the ambassadors, which essentially used to be at the forefront of making policy, many of those are now at the forefront of simply doing good relations in their countries. Handing out dictionaries in some store, holding a dinner party for something, hopefully learning something about the country and feeding it back into the State Department and so forth. But their role has fundamentally and historically changed, right? Which, of course, makes it less serious if the person is just a political appointee with money, right, than it used to be. If you don't know anything about the country that you've just been sent to, it's not good. And it's not, the receiving country might not be happy about it. But it's not devastating to the policy-making process because you probably don't have much of a role anywhere. If you go to a third world country sometimes, or in my case, if you go, for example, to an African country, you often see the U.S. ambassador featured on the front page of the newspaper every day, almost. And what they're featured about is precisely a photograph of them handing over some books or a dictionary to some school or something like that. So it's not the only thing they do, but it gives you an idea as to how these people keep themselves occupied. Yes.
So, in terms of what's happened to the State Department, et cetera, in the Trump administration, do you think there is some underlying ideology or policy, or at least by Trump's advisors, or is it some mix of incompetence and randomness?
I would say, yes. Is there some sort of logic or ideology or something behind our policymaking process, or is it just random, whatever Trump thinks that morning, or his advisors, right? And Bannon is key now. I mean, he has very clear views, and we could discuss what those are. I'm sorry, Bolton. That's Bolton. Sorry, I misspoke. So it's a combination of both. Don't forget that the Secretary of State and heads of various units in the State Department are typically appointees nowadays, often with diplomatic experience, but not necessarily. Right? And those appointees are appointed under a very ideological president they're consistent with the ideology. So Bolton at this particular point says, you know, you can get appointed, but she can't because he's on my side and so forth. So it becomes ideological very, very, very quickly. And the career people, right, are tearing their hair out by saying, you look, our information and our, you know, what we know and so forth suggests A, and these people are doing B, and essentially you then have the choice of resigning or shutting up. You know, if you're close to retirement, you resign. That's why so many people resign. If you're not close to retirement, then what do, right? So, yes?
Can you talk about the role of investigative journalists?
The role of investigative journalists and, Yes. She wants to know the role of investigative journalists and what role they have in the policy-making process. Investigative journalists nowadays also play a more important role because they too, within seconds, can get the information back to their bosses, the newspapers, and so forth. For a long period of time after the Second World War, investigative journalists were fairly specialized. The ones in the Middle East knew Arabic. They spent years there. You particularly notice that if you listen to the BBC. They have real deep expertise in their investigative journalism. Somewhat less so in the U.S., where we cycle people through more rapidly, or newspapers cycle them through more rapidly. But still, they have an input. Under the best of circumstances, let's paint an ideal utopian vision. You're in the Middle East, you speak Arabic, you've been to several countries, you have incredibly good relations with people in that government, and maybe even opposition groups and so forth. So you are capable of networking very well. And therefore, people in the U.S. State Department and military, if they're smart, would answer the phone when you called and said, are you aware of X and Y is happening? And so they can have an informal impact. Their formal impact, of course, is to write what we then think about it. Right? And of course, right now, everything they write that is not inconsistent with the government policy is just fake news. Right? But they have a role. And when you, in civil conflicts and wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth, the journalists very often are the targets and they get killed. An enormous number of journalists nowadays are getting killed. And they get killed because they're a threat, right? They've just discovered something. And so it is a very risky business nowadays. And as the U.S. becomes less and less popular in various places, right, the journalists are even more at risk. So if I would say, if you're a journalist, stay home right now, or at least don't go into a into a war zone. Journalists, what about those that are embedded? Typically, the U.S. military has allowed journalists to be embedded so they can report accurately on a particular military intervention, let's say in Iraq during the war and so forth. Generally speaking, those things are censored. The Defense Department censors them and makes sure that what you're reporting is in fact not giving out secrets that they don't want. But they still usually get a lot of information and get a feel for where the population is. Because one of the things, of course, that the State Department was meant to be doing in terms of foreign policy is not just interact with the government and government agencies, but to get a feel of the population. So you've probably just recently read the results of the election in Bavaria, right, where the right wing didn't succeed and where the center parties all lost out, and surprisingly the Greens got a fair 17 or 18% or something of the vote. So there you have a situation is if there had been good reporting on the ground in Bavaria, which is not, high on the agenda for the New York Times or anybody else, would they have sensed how the vote was going to go? Probably not on the part of the U.S., but would some of the German press and have sensed it? Well, that could help a lot, So those are the kinds of roles the press plays. There was a hand up here somewhere, back there. What do diplomats do? Who are the diplomats? Is the first question. Diplomats is, for example, the ambassador. It may be other people who are appointed as ambassadors. Sometimes countries, including the U.S., have ambassadors somewhere, but in addition, appoint somebody as a diplomat to do a particular negotiations or to do a particular. So that then means that they have the status of a diplomat. And the status of the diplomat, we throw the words around here, you're being diplomatic and so forth and so on. But the status of a diplomat is deeply embedded in international law, their rights, their duties, and their protection. So as soon as you anoint somebody as a diplomat, and don't just call somebody who goes somewhere as a diplomat, right? You could, you could send me somewhere and saying, well, I consider her a diplomat to something. That doesn't make me a diplomat. And in order for a diplomat to have the protection and the coverage that diplomats have, okay, the receiving country has to acknowledge the diplomat and accept him or her. And if they do something wrong, compile too many traffic tickets in New York City, in some senses, if you have diplomat written on your license plate, you can do all kinds of things. But you do have to pay traffic fines if you park illegally, right? So some of the embassy's diplomats piled up hundreds of thousands of dollars of traffic tickets over a period of 5 or 10 years. So what can New York City do? They have formal diplomatic, can't touch them, right, in New York City. So all the New York City can do is plead with them. And if they really can't stand you anymore as a diplomat because all you're doing, you have to ask the State Department to withdraw their diplomatic privileges and so forth. Typically what happens is those people get sent home. Right? If you're a diplomat, you get sent home. You don't normally get prosecuted. Every now and then you get prosecuted. There was a Russian drunk who killed somebody on the streets of Washington, D.C. 10 or 15 years ago. And the crime was so horrendous that the Russians actually allowed him to be prosecuted and criminally found guilty and imprisoned and all the rest of it. Right? So diplomats have formal status. They're deeply embedded in international law. Almost all countries adhere to it, and because it is in their interest to adhere to it, because it protects their own people if they treat other people appropriately according to international law. And every now and then there are violations, and then there are big hullabaloos about it. Is every person who works in the State Department or Defense Department a diplomat? No. right? You have to have when you send somebody somewhere, they maybe do diplomatic things, right? But you have to sort of formally get government that you're sending them to accept you, the person, and they can decline to accept you. They can just say, we don't like this guy who's, got a beard and wearing glasses. We don't want him. And then you can't, that's it. The U.S. doesn't have to have you, or some other country doesn't have you. Does that answer your question? Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Aren't diplomats also appointed to international organizations, like doesn't the UN representative have diplomatic status, and people at OECD are diplomats?
Yes, in international institutions, you also very often can do people who are representative in international institutions like the UN and so forth have diplomatic status. Many of them do, all of them don't. And the UN building just in New York is a funny thing because it's like an embassy. Inside the gates is not American territory. And that has often become very conflicting when there are riots or demonstrations. Can the U.S. police follow the demonstrators who are, let's say, throwing rocks or whatever, follow them from the street inside the gates of the fence of the UN? And the answer is no. The UN police has to take care of them inside, unless the UN Secretary of State or whoever asks the New York police to come in. So that's like an embassy, right? And the head of the delegation, and sometimes some people below, but not always, also have diplomatic standing. Okay, and the diplomatic standing for representatives from other countries in the United States is also very complicated, and I won't bore you with all the details, just to say that they're pretty much limited under normal circumstances to New York City. And if they want to travel to Ohio, they have to ask for permission. They are not free to roam, typically. Okay, so it gets very arcane, and I don't want to bore you with the arcaneness, but the basic question is correct. International institutions, the head of delegations and so forth, normally have diplomatic coverage. I think you were next.
I've been told that we have or had some formal relationship with the Vatican.
Yes, the Vatican is treated like a sovereign state, and there's an ambassador to the Vatican. Does anybody know who the ambassador is right now? Wait a second.
Some movie stars.
Newt Gingrich's wife is the current ambassador to the Vatican. The Vatican is another one of these, Tony places. Serious diplomats don't get sent there, but it's like a privilege either for a person who's played a major role in the Catholic Church and they want to reward him, but typically it's also, in this case, it's Newt Gingrich's wife. Now, for those of you who've been to the Vatican, you know it's a very small place, and there isn't a lot of diplomacy to be done, but yes, it's treated like a sovereign state. Yes?
I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but the way that the administration has responded to the situation in Turkey in the consulate, Saudi Arabian consulate.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what organizations or what people or entities is behind their response, their current response to
America's response to what's going on?
Saudi Arabia?
Oh, yes. I mean, sorry. Do I have an idea as to where American policy at the moment comes from? That is to say, why do we have the response we do? Well, 20% of our military sales go to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has huge investments all over the place in the U.S. Saudi Arabia is deeply embedded in Trump's businesses, hotels and whatnot. The readers of the New York Times will know that at the moment, or in the next few months, the museums in New York all have major shows on the Middle East art, right? They've coordinated. Museum of Modern Art, Metropolitan, Guggenheim, they all are already have or will have major shows of Middle East art. And you say, huh?
San Francisco.
San Francisco, but I'm not sure about San Francisco. Yeah. Yes, I know, but I'm not sure how that was funded, so I want to be cautious about that. All those shows in New York City on Islamic art were funded by Saudi Arabia. If you headed one of these museums right now, you're not going to not have the show. But where do you stand on American relations with Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia has tons of money, and they're all over the place, and they're all over the place in the U.S. Do you want to sharply cut relations with Saudi Arabia and have Saudi Arabia saying, the hell with you, America, we are now sending our money to wherever, you know, Africa, China, wherever, India, wherever, right? So Saudi Arabia has a lot of leverage because they have tons of money. The U.S. is deeply embedded from museums to Trump and everything in between in Saudi Arabia. They're trying to figure out some way to say something modestly critical about human rights, and not too much, and at the same time do what Trump says was, yes, we're going to take strong action and we're going to condemn them, but we're certainly not going to cut the military spending because, God, folks, you're going to have unemployment in all of those industries. And we're coming up to an election. How would you like to be in California in the military industry and just know that 50 or 80% of all of what you're producing right now is going to Saudi Arabia and it's about to be cut? It is not just a fear of how Republicans will vote, it's even a fear of how some centrists and some even Democrats might vote, right? So when a country like Saudi Arabia has so much influence in the economy, the policies, the, God knows, the museums, education, or whatnot in the U.S., you'd be surprised how many American colleges have huge amounts of money. Not UCSC, they don't have any money, but you know, University of Southern California and lots of other places, how much funding in those institutions that's necessary for medical research, for all kinds of research, is funded by the Saudis. They are all over the place in this country, right? And so Trump is, you know, fairly comfortable in saying, we've got to figure out, we can all tear our hair out about what's just happened, and Congress can condemn, and Congress will condemn, and Congress will take certain actions. But is it not comprehensible what's happening? It is totally comprehensible, right? And the same kind of thing is true with, let's say, China and its embeddedness, building things, so many investments all over Asia, Africa, and so forth. Again, for those of you who look at the front page of the New York Times, there is a story this morning of a Chinese company in Nairobi, Kenya. And they employ quite a lot of local people. And the local people have learned that their bosses, who are Chinese, refer to them both behind their backs and straight to their face as monkeys. Okay? If you were the Kenyan government, or you were whatever, you would say, get out of here. But the Kenyan economy is very dependent on those kinds of investments. So the interdependence nowadays that I keep talking about is very deep, and it's very deep in terms of people, money, economics, the environment. We have to get back to climate change someday and so forth. The notion that you have this hard shell country and it has foreign affairs that go out and sometimes come in, when in fact the whole thing is totally porous. And it's politics, military, economic. Military used to be thought of as the military invading somewhere, right? Then it became an idea of the military being, let's say, headquartered somewhere, like NATO, right? American soldiers in NATO or in South Korea. Now it is interlinking, then it became the military of other countries being trained in the US. That's still happening. Go to military bases in the South sometime. There are people from all over the world being trained along with the US military. Now it's military hardware and sales as well, military intelligence, and all of that. The interdependence that we don't necessarily think about when we get up on a Tuesday morning is so profound these days that it hobbles almost all policy issue areas. So that even if you have a president who ideologically you feel okay about, which may not be right now, but it's happened before, it may happen again. That person has a limited freedom and does not have, or does have, incredible encumbrances between all of these linkages that have been built up. The one area of freedom, of course, is to not sort of disaggregate from the world, and to say the way we have maximum control is to stay in the world, to continue to be interdependent, to be part of multilateral organizations, because that's how your influence comes in various issue areas. When you do what we're currently doing is, on the one hand, being in an empirical sense, very interdependent, but in an ideological and philosophic sense, saying America alone, let's nationalism, the hell with the rest of the world. What you have is a kind of contradiction. You have this incredible networking that you're part of, and at the same time, you're saying we don't really want to be part of the global governance structure, which makes this system viable. But if you're part of the global governance structure, you can't just always make everybody do what you want to do. You sometimes have to compromise, right? And when you undo yourself from trade pacts and all those things I'll talk about next time, what you're achieving in a sense is you have a lose-lose strategy. You tirade out there. You lose what in the international politics business is called soft power. Soft power is your ability to influence. It's the ability of diplomats to do their work. It's the ability to convince people, to get people to compromise, and so forth. Hard power is military power, or the threat of it. And I would submit to hard power nowadays, you have to add economic power, because it also is quite hard, and the Saudi situation shows it, right? But one of the things we used to be good at was precisely soft power. Even if we were hypocrites ourselves, we had the Vietnam War, we had and we still have racism and all the rest. People could always say, U.S. democracy is far from perfect, they're imperfect, they need to be criticized, and so forth. Nevertheless, we gave the world the image that aspirationally we were in favor of democracy and fairness and so forth. And we have let go of that aspiration. We're saying we're looking out for ourselves. We may or may not have domestic aspirations, but we certainly don't have global aspirations. And while it looks good on paper, in practice, by not having global aspirations in terms of democracy and tolerance for people and so forth, diversity and so forth, at the same time, when you're completely interlinked, you have a contradiction for almost all foreign policy. You can say this is good for us, but unless you take into account the linkages that you're already part of and that you can't get out of. I mean, Trump can get us out of more international organizations and mechanisms than we already have, right? He can quit the UN, he can send NATO home, he can do all of those things. At the end of the day, it means we no longer have control of anything, right? Because climate change will continue, for example. There's nothing you can do about it. You can sit in Iowa and saying, boy, do I agree with Trump, all these environmental policies drive me crazy, let's not have them. But eventually you can't grow your grain anymore. You can sit in Florida and say, of course I'm in favor of Trump and his supporters. Unfortunately, my house will flood every 2 years as these hurricanes came. Well, they don't have anything to do with climate change. Yeah, wait what kind of world your children are going to live in and your grandchildren. So interdependence is permanent. You can disaggregate here or there, but it is permanent. And therefore, you can't have it both ways. And at the moment, we want it both ways. We want to reduce our role in the world in foreign policy. We want to shrink our foreign policy. We want to get away from interdependence, while at the same time being permanently interdependent in many ways. Climate change is one, but also other things. All right, one more question and I should liberate you. Yes, you've been.
What is your opinion of the UN as an effective and meaningful institution?
What is my opinion of the UN as a meaningful and effective institution? The UN and almost all post-World War II institutions are no longer very effective because they have not kept up with the world as it is changing. In order, you can go two ways. You can either say, and therefore we're going to get rid of them, or we're going to get out of them, or therefore we're going to be at the forefront and leadership of reforming them and making them meaningful in the 21st century. And my opinion is that if you don't make all these institutions, not just the UN, NATO, European Union, all of things, if you don't make them meaningful for now and for the future, you get to exactly what I was talking about in the previous comments. That is to say, a world that's interdependent without having meaningful input into how that world develops. So yes, I can criticize the UN until hell freezes over, but the answer is not you pull out here, you pull out there, you reduce the budget and so forth. You put your shoulder behind the wheel of helping to reform the institution. And you can't reform institutions if you badmouth them and say they're useless to begin with. No way. All right, next time, I'll see you.